Hello, I am Lexi, and this is what you should know. This week, I am trying something new. Kind of an anthology episode with 3 cases that really didn't get enough airtime. So please let me know what you think about this in the comment sections relevant to this episode on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and anywhere else really. Email me. But before we jump too deep into what will undoubtedly be harrowing cases of familicide and domestic violence, let's have a quick update regarding the William Tyrrell case. Because, I like to keep up with that one, and I like to keep you guys informed where I can. While there are those that will say that this isn't directly related to the case, I strongly believe that it is, when you consider the fact that the foster parents are facing charges related to assault of a minor. Week before last, the suppression order was lifted on what happened regarding this assault charge. And it came out that they had grabbed this young girl around the throat, hit her with a wooden spoon, kicked her, and left her in what they were calling timeout for over 40 minutes. This was followed up by the foster mother threatening the little girl, saying that if she defecated on the floor, she would rub her face in it. Truly a terrible incident for this poor child. They are defending themselves, saying that they were trying to correct bad behavior in this child. However, I feel like I shouldn't have to point out that beating a child isn't going to correct behavior. It is instead going to traumatize the child, causing them to continue what is obviously going to become a cycle of abuse. As my mother says, if you hit a child, you've obviously lost control. On one hand, I am glad this child's identity is suppressed. She doesn't need to be dragged through all kinds of hell. However, we do not know if this poor child is some random kid or in fact William's older sister. If it is the older sister, then I'm glad that they were able to remove her from the home, as there is a high chance things would have gone down a similar path with her as it did with William. I know it isn't proven at this time. I know. But looking at the circumstantial evidence, because let's be honest, the cops aren't going to show us everything until it is in the bag and the conviction is put in place. I am willing to say, which isn't honestly a shock to anyone, I believe they killed William and disposed of his body. If I am proven wrong, I will gladly apologize. But right now, they are proving anger issues and violence against children. There is even a history in the investigative articles that have been published where there appears to be violence against William. At this point, aside from a psychic that claims William is living his best life in Western Australia, I think it's safe to say a lot of people believe William is no longer alive. The decent thing they could honestly do is allow his family the closure so they can lay him to rest. But that is enough of my ranting on a case that's not relevant to the episode. Let's get into it. This is what you should know about the May family massacre. Born in 1964, Peter May grew up allegedly being physically abused by his parents. As he got older, he became a gun enthusiast and began hunting for pigs and rabbits at a young age. Later in his youth, he joined a gun club, owned a small bore rifle, and also had a fascination for crime and detective TV shows. If it had ended with an interest in guns and crime shows, I am sure he wouldn't be insanely different from most people, even those listening to this podcast. However, it was how everything devolved that truly makes the difference. Peter and Helen had been married for 12 years by 1996. Together they had 3 children, Lisa, Andrew, and Natalie. However, it wasn't all roses and family dinners. Peter was a violent and controlling man, using his abusive tactics to get what he wanted. His behavior was unpredictable and could change from kind and affectionate to unprovoked cruelty without warning. At times, he would abuse his children in a similar manner, as had happened to him during his childhood, and he threatened his wife that he would kill her and the children if she were to ever try to leave him. Isn't he a real charmer? Like, husband of the year, right? But much like a terrible late-night infomercial, there is more. Due to his failed business ventures and pathological gambling, Peter had put himself under significant and constant financial distress. The only way he managed to prevent bankruptcy was from frequent loans from his parents and participating in financial scams. This only took him so far, though, as in 1990 he finally had to file for bankruptcy. You would think that having to do so would humble a person, but not Peter May. This actually led him to increase his criminal activities, such as fraud and money laundering. In this specific practice, he would apply for loans from credit companies with false names and employment records, and then use the money to buy cars, just to resell them immediately before vanishing. Peter and his family lived in a duplex in Middle Park, with his in-laws living in the flat under them, which also served as a refuge for the children during his violent outbursts. The house was lucky to be paid off in November of 94, but Peter, the ever-greedy and selfish creature he was, had it remortgaged, and within 12 months lost most of the money by gambling it at Jupiter's casino. Eventually his forgeries became sloppy, and he was investigated by the police for one of his credit applications. And on July 3rd, 1995, his house was searched and enough evidence was collected to charge him. Police sought to arrest him in August that same year, and under the pressure of his imprisonment, his violence against his family increased. As a consequence of this, his wife began planning to leave him. The other thing to consider here is, if Peter is in prison and out of the picture, Helen May would have finally felt safe enough to leave, because he wouldn't be right there to physically stop her. On November 16th, Peter's defense lawyer made his appearance at the Criminal Investigation Branch, where he was charged with forgery and was released on bail. After this, he decided to drive to Jupiter's casino to gamble, either as stress relief or to celebrate being free on bail. I cannot be sure, but when he eventually returned home, he found that his family was gone. Over the next couple of days, Peter's emotional condition alternated between sorrow and fury, and he repeatedly called his wife's sister, Angela, to inquire about his family's whereabouts. Abusers often take on the role of victim when their target finally leaves. This can go from the shallow end of the scale by accusing them of cheating or changing the story so they can reverse the roles, all the way to the extreme of stalking, assault, or murder. 4 days after their disappearance, he was served a temporary protection order, prohibiting him from contacting his family, and police confiscated his rifle. This protection order became permanent in late November, and a committal date regarding his fraud trial was set in late January. However, he would never make it to that hearing. Peter attempted to regain access to his children via his solicitor, and also visited the Men's Rights Association in Brisbane. It is believed that this MRA convinced him to hire a private investigator to hunt down his wife. As time went by, Helen saw a change in his attitude and agreed to sporadic visits to buy the children before Christmas, on Boxing Day, and for a fortnight in January. Unfortunately, what she didn't see was Peter closing his children's bank accounts, changing his last will, excluding his wife and children, and naming his sister as the sole heir. When he sent his sister the testament, she called him, afraid he was suicidal, but he calmed her down, assuring her that he had no such plans. Unfortunately, she believed him. On the 11th of January, Peter drove his children to Jupiter's casino, where they stayed for 10 days in the penthouse suite, and afterwards stayed a further 4 days at Dockside in Brisbane. During this time, Peter called his wife several times, asking her to join them, but she continued to decline his offer. Peter had accrued $13,000 of debt on his credit card, and he and his children returned to his home in Middle Park, since he was to hand over the children to his wife 2 days later. On the 24th of January, Peter wrote 2 farewell letters, one addressed and sent to a friend of his, where he outlined his chilling plan and how he would keep his children forever, and a second one addressed but not sent to his wife, whose whereabouts was still unknown to him at this time. Unfortunately, the exact sequence of events of the next morning is not known. However, it is assumed that around 4 a.m. on January 25th, Peter packed an illegally obtained Winchester 6-shot lever-action rifle, woke his children, and drove with them to his wife's hideout in Hillcrest, after obtaining the address from their kids. Around 5 a.m., the 32-year-old shot and killed his 3 children, and then entered the house, where he killed his wife and her parents before committing suicide. Unfortunately, that is all that is known, as the only few other articles I could find on the subject were opinion pieces regarding the far-right Men's Rights Association. Which, honestly, I am not here for a battle of the sexes. I am here for the truth of these crimes. But to follow down the same line of family annihilators, this is what you should know about the Dowd family massacre. Fowd, also known as Fred and Selson Dowd, moved to Australia with their 4 young children from Lebanon in 1969. They settled in suburban Sydney, where several extended family members were already living. A few years later, after settling in, their 5th child, John, was born. Selson had learnt to sew shortly after arriving in Australia, and had quickly found work as a seamstress with a local clothing manufacturer. She was a conscientious worker and a good employee. However, when John was born, there was little chance that she would be able to return to the factory any time too soon. As they didn't want to lose such a great employee, her employer, in a move that was well before its time, provided her with a sewing machine, and from that point on, she did most of her work from at home. Fred had initially found work in a local factory, and from the time they arrived in Sydney, he remained employed until a workplace accident in 1977 left him with a spinal injury that prevented him from undertaking any strenuous physical labor. The injury resulted in him being awarded a workers' compensation payout of $25,000, which was a considerable amount of money in those days. But from that time on, he rarely had paid work. This started a vicious cycle of money problems. Money was always tight, a situation that was made considerably worse by the fact that Fred liked to gamble, often losing what little they had playing cards or betting on the horses. Due to this, the family was evicted from several rental properties for failing to pay their rent. Fred's compensation should have been enough to set them up nicely. Unfortunately, he wasted roughly $15,000 of it on gambling, leaving his family with just $10,000 to put towards a deposit on a house, a traditional brick bungalow that they purchased in First Avenue, Campsie. This left Selson in an unfortunate position of workhorse wife, where she would be the only one bringing money in, with Fred spending almost every cent gambling it away. But that, unfortunately, wasn't the worst of it. Fred was a man with a savage temper, and he was abusive and violent towards his wife. Years in a violent and unhappy marriage would have been so hard on her, but she was isolated and had little support available. She mostly kept quiet and put up with her husband's gambling and abuse for the sake of the children. Unfortunately, as time went on, Fred's violent outbursts escalated, eventually getting to the point where the local police were regularly being called to their home. However, as was typical at the time, when the police arrived, they did little more than order Fred out of the house for a few hours to cool off before allowing him to return home, which did little to stop him from attacking his wife again. At one point in 1980, Fred beat Susan so badly that she needed to be hospitalized. But even then, he somehow managed to avoid being charged with assault. In December that year, in a violent rage, Fred threw his wife and children out of the house and onto the street. Selson had finally had enough. Out of desperation and fear that her family would lose the house that she'd worked so hard to keep, she turned to the courts and filed for divorce. And by March of 81, she had obtained a restraining order against her husband and a family court order giving her sole occupancy of the house. The court orders also extended to protect the children by restricting Fred's access to his kids, allowing him to see them just once a week, each Sunday, and strictly prohibiting him from going anywhere near the family home. Despite the court orders, the police continued to be called to the house over the following months, as Fred continued to show up unannounced and verbally abuse Selson and demanded money. Appallingly, the approach from the police wasn't any different to when they were still married. On the 21st of September 1981, Fred was finally told that the police would arrest him if he ever returned to the house after threatening to kill his estranged wife and children. Later that exact same day, Fred brazenly walked into Bankstown Police Station, about a 20 minutes drive from Campsie, and filled out a simple application on which he declared he had no criminal record. then paid an administration fee of $2 and was issued a shooter's license. Now, in 1981, digital records weren't heard of. So the police officer who processed Fred's shooter's license had no idea about the domestic violence orders against him. Nor did he know that only hours earlier, Fred had breached those orders and threatened to kill his family again. He would have had an idea if he had made a simple telephone call to Fred's local police station. A few days later, he legally purchased a .22 rifle and a hunting knife. 2 days after his last illegal visit, Fred returned to the family home and demanded to see his children. Again, Southern refused him entry and called the police. Fred was furious, but he knew the police would arrest him if they saw him at the property again, so he fled. Unfortunately, it wouldn't have mattered if he had stayed, as the police never arrived at the house that afternoon. In the early hours of September 24th, 1981, Fred returned to his wife's house with his newly acquired rifle and large hunting knife. The blood-chilling events that came next would need to be pieced together by detectives from police forensics and the account given by 9-year-old John. A little before 1:45 a.m., Fred broke into the house and made his way to the bedroom shared by his 2 eldest boys. There he shot and killed his 21-year-old son, Najib, and then shot and wounded Joseph, who was 18. It was a calculated move that ensured that only 2 of his children physically capable of challenging him were incapacitated first. Fred then made his way to the master bedroom, where his younger son, John, and his estranged wife were sleeping. He ignored John, but then aimed his rifle and shot Southern in the head, killing her instantly. With his wife dead, Fred turned his rage to his 19-year-old daughter, Yola, who, woken by the noise, had walked out into the hallway. Without hesitation, he shot her where she stood. He then turned his gun on another of his sons, Simon, who was only 15 when he too walked out of his room to see what was going on. It was about this time that John finally woke up and was confused by the commotion. He slipped off the bed and turned on the bedside lamp. What he saw next would haunt him for years. His mother's dead body laying next to him. He didn't hear any of the gunshots. Then his father stalked towards his brother, Joseph, and fired another shot. The bullet missed its target, and Fred disappeared. Joseph, who'd already been shot by his father, came storming towards the sound of the gunfire in an effort to stop his father. But having lost a considerable amount of blood, he was little match for Fred, who quickly fought him off and stabbed him with his knife, leaving Joseph bleeding on the floor. Fred left the room and went to the back of the house. With their father out of the room, Joseph urged John to call for help. Too short to reach the phone, John pulled a chair over to the wall and climbed up to dial 000, the Australian emergency number. The call was answered at 1:46. And at first, the emergency operator thought John's call was a prank, but it was soon apparent that the young caller was in dire need of help. The call ended at 1:50 a.m., and a radio message was broadcast to the police less than 60 seconds later. With help on the way, John went back to his brother and sat with Joseph, who was bleeding out. As the 2 of them sat there silently waiting for help, Fred burst back into the room and shot Joseph again, this time in the head. Just as he did earlier, he ignored John, turned around, and ran out of the room. Within minutes of John's call, police swarmed the Campsie property, and as the first officers ran up the front pathway towards the house, they heard a gunshot from inside. It turned out to be the final shot Fred fired, the one which he took his own life. Rosario Signorelli was the first police officer to arrive at the scene. John opened the door as far as he could, but Rosario could not push it further open, as something was obstructing the door. The body of 19-year-old Yola was blocking the door, and John had no other choice but to grab his sister's lifeless legs and drag her corpse out of the way so the police could get in. In a twist, Joseph was somehow still alive when the police got to him. The 18-year-old was quickly rushed to hospital, but unfortunately his injuries were catastrophic, and he died soon after arriving, leaving 9-year-old John completely alone. 16 years later, at the age of 25, John sued the state of New South Wales and the Office of the Police Commissioner for failing their duty of care by issuing his father with a shooter's license. John's barrister, Mr. David Rolfe, argued that Fowd should have never been issued with a shooter's license, as he had threatened to shoot members of his family, and the police knew this. He also told the court that Fred had put his wife in hospital the year before the murders, and that police knew this too, and they were aware there was a restraining order against Fred to protect his family. With Fred's history of physical and verbal abuse being well documented, he argued they should have known, and they could have easily found out that Sousan had been granted sole ownership of the family's home because of Fred's violent behavior and ongoing gambling problem. The jury also heard evidence from a psychiatrist who told the court that John Dowd, who had once been a delightful young man, had forever been traumatized and changed by his father's actions and was at risk of committing suicide. In response, Mr. Don Grieve, acting for the police commissioner, argued that in 1981 it was over the top to expect police would have made a thorough background check. Should that person go and interview the wife of the husband, children, neighbors, the bank manager? Where does it all stop, he said. How far does it have to go before he can be satisfied? And to that, I say that is a stupid argument. The police were lazy. All it would have taken is one phone call to the local police station, and they would have known. So no, they didn't need to interview the wife of the husband, children, neighbors, or the bank manager. They needed to call the station local to the applicant to say that it is over the top is just plain lazy. In the end, the jury thankfully sided with John and found that the police had failed their duty of care and should never have issued Fred with a shooter's license. John was awarded with $250,000 in compensation. While researching this case, I found it was one of the 13 reasons why the Australian government put in place strict gun laws. In the 15 years before the Port Arthur massacre, there'd been 13 mass shootings, including the Dowd family massacre. So really, to those who said that it was a quick action, it really wasn't. There was a lot more thought behind it. The Port Arthur massacre was just the final straw. And finally, I have one more story for you. However, this one will be quite short, as the reason it is so hard to hear about this family massacre is it took place in 1931. So the records would not have been well kept, and it was 8 years prior to World War II. All I could find on this case was an old archived news article and an interview with Distant Relations in 2018. So I will openly admit that reading the news article from the 30s was a trip, to say the least. When referring to the children of the family, it referred to them as kiddies. I find the word kiddies really disturbing, if I'm perfectly honest. But that is neither here nor there, nor even remotely relevant to this case. So, this is what you should know about the Davies family massacre. 36-year-old Roderick Davies and his wife, 32-year-old Dorothy Davies, were considered inseparable and a deeply loving couple. During their relationship, the couple had 5 children: 14-year-old Dulcie, 12-year-old Robert, 9-year-old Dorothy Lorne, 7-year-old Roderick Henry, and 5-month-old Alfred. Roderick was an out-of-work carpenter, receiving government relief. He was considered to be quite intelligent and inquisitive, changing his views frequently. He recently had changed from atheism to spiritualism and become quite interested in the afterlife. He had chillingly said to a friend before the massacre, "As life continues after death, what is the use of struggling on?" Unfortunately, no one took notice of the remark at the time. Dorothy was described as a devoted wife and mother, living for her husband and family, and was so proud of their children. These children were described through the 1931 article as bright and lovable. Unfortunately, they never got the chance to live their full lives and share with the world what gifts they may have had. In the early hours of August 21st, 1931, Mr. Nifton, a friendly neighbour, came by the house of the Davies. It was around 9 a.m. when he saw a sign on the door saying, "Mr. Nifton, open the door." Assuming it was a prank of some kind, he did so, only to find a true nightmare before him. He saw Roderick seated in a cane chair in the first room of the house with a bullet wound to his head and a bloody left wrist. In the bed alongside the chair lay Dorothy. She was dressed in her bed clothes, barely covered by a blood-stained blanket with a bullet wound to her head. Nifton did what any normal person would do in this situation, and that is to leave immediately and call the police. The police arrived and searched the remainder of the four-roomed house, only to find in one room Dulcie, Robert, and 5-month-old Alfred. From what could be seen, all three had been shot in the head at close range while they slept, but nothing was said for how Dorothy Lawn and Roderick Henry were found. I assume due to how heavily they went on to say they loved each other and their family, that they were found in their own beds in a similar state, especially due to the line in the 1931 article saying they had known nothing before their end. On the table were the butts of 18 cigarettes, cough syrup, and 6 letters that would reveal the truth behind what had really happened that night. It turns out that the catalyst for this tragedy was a combination of Roderick's unemployment and newfound faith. He believed so deeply that what lay on the other side would be better for him and his family. And Dorothy, being a dutiful and loving wife, listened to what he had to say on the topic and unfortunately believed everything he was saying. In the letter she wrote to her mother, she told her not to grieve because her family was going to a better place. Some of her exact wording was, "I have been writing under spiritual control for months and have known for a long time that we would all be going soon. Do not grieve for me. I am so beautifully happy." The inquest that followed found the dreadful tragedy was brought on by the attempt of a man to study spiritualism when he was not suited to study it. He believed in a short road to an attractive hereafter, and he had the mother who aided and abetted him completely under his control. And on that grim note, that is all I have for you this week. In the show notes, I will have contact information for Beyond Blue, Lifeline, 1-800-RESPECT, and Mensline Australia. If you or someone you know is struggling, please reach out for help. It is never too late. I will be sharing photos for these cases on Instagram and Facebook. What You Should Know, Australia. Please let me know if you enjoyed this episode format by commenting in the comment section for this episode, whether that is, as I said earlier, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, or you can send me an email with anything you want to say, including any Australian ghost stories that you want to share with me. I really, really want them. Please send them. I would really love it. I'm not being sarcastic. I promise. You can send those to whatyoushouldknowaustralia@gmail.com. But until next week, stay safe and stay hydrated. Bye!